The night had settled heavy over the city, wrapping the streets in a dull yellow glow from broken lamps and tired shop signs. For her, night was never a time of rest. It was when hunger spoke the loudest and loneliness felt sharp enough to cut. She was a black woman living on the edge of survival, known by no one important, noticed by none who mattered. Her days were spent collecting leftovers, doing small unnoticed work, and stretching kindness further than her own needs would allow. Poverty had hardened the world around her, but it had not hardened her heart. Even when her stomach burned with emptiness, she believed that suffering did not give anyone the right to turn cruel. She lived in a narrow space that barely deserved to be called a home, where the walls carried the smell of old meals and silent prayers. Every night, before eating herself, she saved a small portion, sometimes just a piece of bread, sometimes rice barely warm, because somewhere out there, she believed, someone might be hungrier than her. The city had taught her fear, but it had also shown her children crying on sidewalks, mothers choosing which child to feed, and strangers turning their faces away. She had learned that kindness was the only thing that kept her human. Outside, luxury cars passed without slowing, guards stood in shadows guarding secrets far bigger than her life, and powerful men slept without knowing the smell of hunger. The world of money, crime, and control moved silently above her, never colliding with her fragile existence, or so she thought. She did not know that fate had already marked this night as different. She did not know that this quiet stretch of pavement was about to connect her life to a Korean man whose name ruled fear, wealth, and blood. For now, she only knew the weight of another night survived, another hunger endured, and the stubborn hope that goodness still mattered in a world that rarely rewarded it. It was sometime past midnight when the sound reached her ears, soft at first, almost lost beneath the distant noise of traffic and the hum of the city. A faint, broken cry drifted through the narrow street, trembling with fear and exhaustion. At first, she thought her mind was playing tricks on her, shaped by too many nights of hunger and worry. But the sound came again, clearer this time, filled with the helplessness that only a child could carry. It pulled at something deep inside her, something the world had failed to destroy. She stepped closer to her door, her heart tightening with caution and concern. The streets were not kind after dark, especially to a woman like her who had nothing to protect her except instinct. Yet the crying did not stop. When she finally looked outside, she saw a small figure curled near the steps, tiny shoulders shaking, face wet with tears, clothes dusty and out of place for the cold night. The child was clearly not from the streets. His skin was pale, his features unmistakably Korean, and his clothes, though dirty now, once belonged to a world far removed from hers. He looked lost, terrified, and completely alone. Fear whispered to her to turn away. A child abandoned at such an hour could mean trouble, gangs, traps, dangers she could not afford. But the child's eyes lifted toward her, wide and desperate, searching not for answers but for safety. Hunger clung to him like a shadow, and exhaustion had drained the strength from his small body. He did not understand where he was or why the world had suddenly become so cruel. Somewhere far away, a powerful Korean man ruled empires of fear and loyalty. But here, his son was nothing more than a frightened child shaking in the dark. She did not know this truth. To her, he was simply a child who had cried enough tears for one lifetime. She noticed his trembling hands, the way his stomach growled softly, the way his eyes kept scanning the shadows as if monsters might rise from them. Whatever world he came from had failed him tonight. And in that moment, her own hunger, her own suffering, felt small in comparison to the fear written all over his face. The city continued breathing around them, indifferent and cold. Somewhere, guards searched, alarms were quietly raised, and rage began to build in a Korean Mafia boss who had not yet realized how close his greatest weakness was to danger. But here, at her doorstep, there were no guns, no power, no wealth, only a crying child and a woman standing at the edge of a choice that would change her life forever. She did not know that this child carried a name powerful enough to shake the city. She only knew that no child deserved to cry alone in the dark. She did not ask where he came from or why he was alone, because she knew that fear often steals a child's ability to answer. Instead, she moved with quiet care, guided by instinct rather than thought. Hunger had taught her how fragile dignity could be, and she refused to take that from him. She brought him inside her small, worn space, not as a stranger but as someone who needed protection. The room held little comfort, yet to the child it felt warmer than the streets, safer than the night that had swallowed him whole. She searched through what little she had and found food meant for herself. It was not much, but she warmed it, breaking portions carefully so his small hands could manage. As he ate, the tension slowly eased from his body. The fear in his eyes softened, replaced by confusion and fragile relief. She watched him quietly, noticing how carefully he ate, how hunger had already taught him discipline beyond his years. It confirmed what she already suspected: this child was not used to being alone or abandoned. Her own stomach ached as she waited, yet she felt no regret. She believed that kindness did not need permission or proof. The world had never given her fairness, but it had given her the power to choose who she became in its cruelty. She wiped the dirt from his face, cleaned his hands, and made a place for him to rest, even though it meant sacrificing her own comfort. For her, survival had never been just about staying alive, it was about staying human. The child watched her with quiet attention, absorbing the gentleness she offered without understanding why a stranger would care so deeply. He had known luxury, protection, and constant watchful eyes, but he had not known this simple, unguarded warmth. Somewhere beyond those walls, loyalty was bought with fear, and obedience was demanded through power. But in this small space, there were no demands, no expectations, only safety freely given. She never once thought about reward. She never imagined that this act would echo beyond the night or reach a Korean man whose name commanded respect and terror. To her, this was just what one did when faced with suffering. She chose kindness without questions, unaware that this quiet decision was planting the roots of a fate far larger than herself, one that would soon pull her into a world of danger, desire, and consequence. Unseen by her, the night was no longer empty. From the moment the child had stopped crying, eyes had begun to gather in the dark, trained, alert, and dangerously patient. Men moved without sound, blending into corners and rooftops, their presence hidden beneath stillness. They were not ordinary watchers. Their posture carried discipline. Their silence carried authority. Panic had already spread through a powerful network, and every second mattered. A missing child was not just a loss, it was a threat to an entire empire built on control. They observed the woman carefully, expecting panic, exploitation, or fear. Instead, they saw restraint. They saw her offer food without hesitation, protection without demand, and care without curiosity. This confused them more than any act of aggression ever could. In their world, every action carried motive, every kindness carried a price. Yet she asked for nothing. She did not reach for a phone. She did not try to bargain with fate. She simply chose to protect. Messages were passed quietly, tension thickening as they confirmed what they were seeing. The child was safe for now. That single fact held the city in balance. The watchers did not move closer. Orders had been given to observe, not interfere, until certainty was achieved. A wrong move could end everything. The men understood the value of patience, but they also understood danger when it appeared gentle and unpredictable from afar. They measured her life in details: the worn walls, the lack of security, the absence of luxury. She was not a threat by power or wealth. And yet, something about her frightened them more deeply than weapons ever had. She had stepped into a moment where greed should have spoken, and instead humanity had answered. That made her different. That made her unpredictable. Beyond the shadows, a Korean man had not yet arrived, but his influence already pressed heavily into the night. His rage, once awakened, would be unforgiving. The watchers knew that when he discovered where his son had been found, questions would follow about this woman, her intentions, and her place in a story that was rapidly growing beyond her control. Still, for now, they remained where they were, silent witnesses to a kindness that none of them could explain, guarding a fragile moment before the storm. The moment the truth reached him, the world shifted. Control rooms lit up, streets were sealed without explanation, and loyal men moved with a precision sharpened by fear. The Korean Mafia boss did not raise his voice, yet every order carried the weight of absolute authority. His empire had been built on discipline, secrets, and loyalty purchased through power, but that night, power meant nothing. His son was missing, and for the first time in years, something truly priceless had slipped beyond his reach. He returned to the city like a gathering storm, his presence enough to unsettle even the bravest of his men. Every detail mattered: the time, the location, the silence that had swallowed the child whole. He replayed each failure in his mind, measuring mistakes that would later demand blood. This was not just a breach of security. It was a personal insult to a man who had crushed enemies for less. Greed had driven many to challenge him before, and every one of them had met an ending that served as a warning. That as reports flowed in, one detail stood out, unsettling him more than the danger itself. The child had been found safe, not rescued by force, not hidden for ransom, not harmed for leverage. He had been fed, protected, sheltered. The words felt unfamiliar, almost threatening. In his world, mercy was weakness, and kindness was often a disguise for betrayal. He demanded to know everything about the woman who had taken his son in her past, her connections, her intentions. Anger burned beneath his calm, but so did something else he did not expect: unease. A life like his had taught him that everyone wanted something. Money, power, protection. Lalach always revealed itself in time. Yet this woman had gained nothing and risked everything. That contradiction unsettled him deeply. It challenged the rules by which he ruled his life and his empire. As he moved closer to reclaiming what was his, the boss prepared for all outcomes. If she had acted with deceit, punishment would be absolute. If she had acted with greed, the price would be unforgivable. But if, against all logic, she had acted with pure intention, then the night had given him something far more dangerous than an enemy. It had given him a truth he had spent a lifetime avoiding. By the time the truth reached her, the night had already done its damage. The child was gone, taken quietly and without struggle, leaving behind a silence heavier than the crying that had first drawn her to him. She stood alone with the weight of unanswered questions, her heart tight with worry and confusion. She had known this moment would come. No child like him simply wandered into a life like hers by accident. Still, knowing did nothing to soften the ache of his sudden absence. The realization arrived slowly, carried by whispered fears and the tension left in the air. The men who had come for the child were not ordinary. Their movements had been too controlled, their eyes too sharp, their silence too intentional. This was not a rescue by desperate parents or the authorities. This was retrieval, the kind that belonged to powerful people who did not ask permission. Only then did she understand how close danger had been and how unaware she had remained. That as fragments of the truth settled, fear finally touched her. She understood now that she had helped someone untouchable, someone surrounded by violence and authority far beyond her understanding. The child had not been lost in the way she first believed. He had belonged to a world of wealth, secrecy, and ruthless protection. And by opening her door, she had stepped unknowingly into that world. There had been no warning, no chance to choose differently. Kindness had carried her there blindly. Regret tried to find its place, but it could not take root. She replayed the night in her mind and found no moment she wished to change. If she had known who the child was, she would have hesitated. She might have turned him away out of fear, and that thought frightened her more than the truth itself. It meant her goodness had existed only because she did not know. The knowledge came too late, but the act remained unchanged. Somewhere beyond her reach, the Korean Mafia boss held his son again, power restored, control reclaimed. And somewhere within her, a quiet understanding formed. Once truth enters a life, it never leaves without consequence. She did not yet know what price would be demanded, or whether her kindness would be rewarded or punished. She only knew that the night she thought would pass like any other had already altered her fate beyond return. Days passed, but the tension never truly left her body. The city felt different now, quieter in a way that carried warning rather than peace. She sensed eyes where there were none, pauses in the air that did not belong to chance. When the reunion finally came, it did not arrive with violence or chaos, but with a calm so controlled it felt heavier than fear. The moment she realized who stood before her, understanding settled deep and irreversible. This was the Korean man whose influence shaped the shadows themselves. The child she had fed had not just belonged to him, he had been his weakness. She expected punishment. A life like hers taught her that power rarely forgave involvement, even accidental. Yet what she received instead was scrutiny deep, unsettling, and patient. He looked at her not as a threat, but as an interruption to the rules that had governed his existence. Everything about her defied expectation. Her lack of fear, her absence of greed, her refusal to shrink under the weight of who he was. She stood with the quiet dignity of someone who had lost too much to be impressed by power. For him, the encounter was equally unsettling. He had prepared himself to face manipulation, desperation, or calculated innocence. Untruth struck at the foundation of everything he had built. Wealth had not protected his son. Men had not protected his son. Kindness had not as their paths crossed again. Something irreversible took shape between them, not trust, not romance yet, but recognition. Two lives from opposite ends of existence had collided, and neither could pretend it meant nothing. She saw in him the loneliness of a man surrounded by loyalty but starved of honesty. He saw in her a strength untouched by power, unbent by hunger or threat. The reunion did not close a chapter. It opened one far more dangerous, where emotions would soon challenge greed, and fate would test whether humanity could survive inside a world built on fear. What began as awareness slowly shifted into something neither of them planned nor controlled. It was not sudden or reckless, but gradual, forming in the spaces between caution and curiosity. He found himself drawn to her presence, not for comfort but for the disruption she caused in his carefully ordered life. Around her, his authority felt unnecessary, almost meaningless. She did not lower her eyes, nor did she challenge him. She simply existed as herself, and that was what unsettled him most. For her, the pull was equally confusing. She had learned to survive by expecting disappointment, by trusting no one fully. Yet with him, there was an honesty beneath the danger that she could not ignore. She saw the man behind the power, a Korean man shaped by violence, burdened by responsibility, and isolated by the empire he ruled. His silence spoke of sacrifices made without forgiveness. She knew loving a man like him meant stepping closer to fire, but she also knew that fear had never been enough to stop her from caring. The connection that grew between them was dangerous because it crossed lines that were never meant to blur. His world thrived on control. Her heart thrived on compassion. Each time their paths met, boundaries weakened. He protected her without announcing it, without seeking credit. She challenged him without realizing it, showing him what strength looked like without cruelty. What he had built through fear began to feel hollow in her presence. Romance did not arrive as promises or dreams. It arrived as understanding. It lived in moments of shared silence, in the way he listened when she spoke, in the way she refused to judge him solely by his reputation. Yet the danger remained constant. Enemies did not disappear because love existed. Greed watched from every corner, waiting for weakness. And nothing was a greater weakness than caring. Deep within him, conflict grew. Loving her meant risking everything he had fought to control. For her, loving him meant walking willingly into a world that could destroy her without remorse. They both understood the cost but continued forward anyway. Some bonds are formed not because they are safe, but because they are inevitable. And once this romance took root, it became something far more threatening than any enemy because it gave his empire something it had never faced before. A heart that it did not take long for the shift to be noticed. In a world ruled by fear and profit, any change in a powerful man's behavior invited attention. Whispers began to travel through hidden corridors and cautious glances lingered where loyalty once stood unquestioned. The Korean Mafia boss had grown different. His focus drifted. His orders became selective. His protection narrowed around one person. And where protection exists, greed is never far behind. Those who had always lived close to power began to calculate. They measured the value of information, the worth of betrayal, and the profit hidden inside emotional attachment. To them, she was no longer just a woman from the streets, she was leverage. Lalach sharpened minds that had long waited for an opening. Some saw opportunity for money. Others saw a way to rise faster by offering her vulnerability in exchange for favor. In their eyes, humanity was currency, and she had become priceless. Even people from her own past, those who once shared her struggles and ignored her pain, began to look at her differently. Envy twisted their memory of her kindness. They convinced themselves she had been lucky, chosen, elevated beyond her place. They did not see the danger wrapped around her life. They saw only potential gain. Greed has a way of justifying cruelty by calling it survival. The atmosphere thickened with intention. Loyalty thinned. Trust became a performance. The empire that once stood firm on fear alone now faced something more unpredictable: desire. Desire for money. Desire for power. Desire to exploit a woman who had never sought anything for herself. In this growing hunger, betrayal was no longer a question of morality but timing. Unaware of how deeply it had spread, she continued to stand where she always had, honest, open, and unguarded. That innocence, once her strength, was now being marked as weakness by those eager to profit. Greed does not announce itself. It waits, and as it awakened in others, it quietly prepared to strike where kindness had been given freely. The first signs of betrayal were subtle, almost invisible at first. A misplaced word, a glance that lingered too long, a promise broken without explanation. She sensed the shift too late because she had always believed in the goodness of people, even in a world ruled by fear and greed. Those she had once thought neutral, perhaps even friendly, had quietly aligned themselves with forces that saw her as a tool rather than a person. The realization struck like ice. Trust, in this world, was a dangerous illusion. The betrayal was not violent at first, but it was precise and calculated. Secrets she had never shared were leaked, and rumors began to swirl, painting her not as the woman who had fed a child, but as someone who had inserted herself into a dangerous world for her own gain. Lies were repeated with confidence, each one designed to weaken her, to isolate her from allies and protection. The Mafia's network was vast, and the people who had once pretended to be loyal were now instruments of dhoka, wielded by greed and fear. The child she had once comforted became a pawn in the larger scheme. Those who coveted her position or sought favor with the Korean Mafia boss used the boy's safety as leverage. Every move she made was scrutinized. Every act of kindness was twisted into a threat. Her past struggles, once invisible, were now exploited to undermine her. The world she had stepped into out of compassion had become a battlefield, and she had no armor except her courage and integrity. Even the man who had grown close to her, whose heart had begun to shift in her favor, was forced to witness the betrayal unfold, powerless to prevent it entirely. The web was too wide, the stakes too high, and the dhoka too intricate. She learned, bitterly, that in a world fueled by power and fear, innocence could be weaponized, and kindness could be attacked from every direction. And yet, despite the cruelty surrounding her, she refused to falter. Even in the face of deception, her spirit did not break. She understood now that survival demanded more than cleverness. It demanded resilience, awareness, and the courage to continue being herself when the world expected her to fold. The betrayal that had threatened to consume her did not go unnoticed by the Korean Mafia boss. The empire he commanded was built on fear, but it was also governed by rules only he could enforce. The moment he discovered the extent of the dhoka, his world shifted from controlled rage to deliberate reckoning. Those who had sought to exploit her kindness for personal gain suddenly realized that power had a cost far higher than they imagined. Loyalty and greed had collided, and he would ensure that the lesson was carved deep. He acted with precision. Every conspirator, every whisperer, every greedy hand that had reached for advantage was identified and held accountable. Punishment came swiftly, not as spectacle, but as inevitability. In his world, justice was not delayed, it was absolute. Some were stripped of wealth, some of power, some of life, but all were left with the knowledge that no treachery would go unpunished, especially against someone he had silently chosen to protect. Watching her remain untouched amidst the chaos became a revelation for him. He saw clearly what she had known all along. Strength did not always come from fear, control, or violence. Sometimes, strength came from integrity, compassion, and the courage to act rightly even when the consequences were unknown. His empire had shaped him into a man who ruled with terror, yet in this awakening, he realized that the woman he had come to care for possessed a form of power far more dangerous than any gun or business deal. For her, witnessing the reckoning was both terrifying and vindicating. She saw the consequences of greed, the sharp edges of betrayal, and the uncompromising nature of a world she had unwittingly entered. Yet, she also saw the protection and respect she had earned not through cunning or fear, but through unwavering humanity. It was a lesson in survival that carried both clarity and a subtle warning. The world would test her, but those who had wronged her would not escape the inevitable. And for him, the Korean Mafia boss, the awakening was deeper than punishment. He recognized that loyalty born of fear could never match the loyalty earned by respect and care. The woman's courage had not only preserved her life, it had illuminated a truth he had long ignored. Compassion, when combined with resilience, could change even the heart of a man who ruled empires. The lines between power and humanity blurred, and in that blur, something far more dangerous, something far more real had begun to take root between them. The night settled with a quiet gravity, as if the city itself had recognized the shift in fate. After the reckoning, the world that had once seemed unyielding and cruel began to make sense in a new way. The black woman who had risked everything by showing simple kindness was no longer just a stranger in a world of power. She had become someone untouchable, respected, and protected. The Korean Mafia boss, who had once believed that fear and control were the only ways to survive, now saw that true strength lay in the heart. Her life, once fragile and overlooked, was now safeguarded by loyalty that no wealth could buy. The men who had plotted against her were removed from the equation, either punished or neutralized, leaving no shadow of threat within reach. The empire, which had seemed entirely merciless, now offered her something she had never sought: recognition. But it was not just recognition that defined her reward, it was the unspoken promise that compassion, courage, and integrity could exist and even thrive, even in the harshest corners of the world. For the Korean Mafia boss, the lesson was deeper. He realized that power alone could never protect what truly mattered. The bond he had formed with her, the trust she had earned without knowing who he was, had changed him in ways money and fear never could. The boy, his son, was safe not because of force or wealth, but because of the selfless heart of a woman who had acted without expectation. That truth rooted itself in his being, forever reshaping his understanding of loyalty, protection, and love. As the city slept under the glow of its harsh lights, their lives intertwined with quiet inevitability. She was rewarded not through wealth or status, but through the respect, safety, and a profound connection she had earned. He, too, found reward not in dominance, but in awakening to the reality that compassion could coexist with power. The story closed not with destruction, but with balance. Dhoka punished, lalach exposed, love and courage recognized, and the universe delivering justice in the form of what she had always deserved. Kindness had been her choice, and in a world that often punished the innocent, it had become her ultimate power. The final injam was clear. Those who act with humanity and heart may stumble, may face betrayal and greed, but ultimately, the universe rewards the pure of spirit, and even the darkest corners can be illuminated by a single, unwavering light.